Welcome back, class. Professor G here. And I want to begin today's lecture by asking you a simple but loaded question. What do you think is the most important event in history? If you had to guess, right? If you had to say, if somebody was pressuring you and they said, hey, you're taking a history class, tell me what's the one thing that I need to know. What's the most important thing? The takeaway message from World History 2, modern history. You may think, well, there's been a lot of important stuff. In the 20th century, right, we have World War I, World War II, we have the atomic bomb. I mean, that's been pretty important. It's shaped modern political history and the political landscape, and the fact that there hasn't been a third world war because of it. There's all sorts of stuff, right? I would say it's this, actually, that the most important event in modern history is the Industrial Revolution. Now, you may think, well, doesn't sound that important. I haven't really heard about it before. Why is this so important? And you have to think of it from an economic standpoint. Think of it from a big question I get to ask is, well, why do I have to take history? What does it matter? The Industrial Revolution affects your life today, affects you as an individual, probably more so than any other event we will talk about in this class. The Industrial Revolution has shaped our lives in the most basic of ways. It has shaped every single aspect of our lives. Right? So you can ask the question, why are we driving around in cars everywhere we go? How does everybody have a car? Industrial Revolution. Right? How does everybody have a small computer in their hand, in their phones, that is powerful enough to send a rocket to the moon? How is that possible historically? The Industrial Revolution. Any basic material question you can ask, from the types of products you can buy at a store to your day-to-day work life. Why do you work shifts? Why do you get paid hourly? Why do you get a paycheck at the end of the week? The Industrial Revolution. All of our modern life, as far as our day-to-day life is concerned, has its roots and its origin in the Industrial Revolution. Now, I've kind of hyped it up a bit, and it should be hyped up, but the Industrial Revolution has some very humble beginnings. It begins actually in 17th century Britain, and it begins in the textile industry. And you think, well, that doesn't sound very exciting. And you'd be right, it's not very exciting. But it's the textile industry, and specifically how they started to produce textiles being cloths, right, that you get clothes and towels and all this other good stuff from. It's the production method of these textiles that sort of leads to this chain reaction of technology and economics, which eventually affects politics and culture. So the Industrial Revolution has its origins in 17th century Britain with these textile mills. And what we see is a shift from hand production, right? Because remember, in the past, if you wanted something, if you wanted clothes, if you wanted a table, if you wanted a house, you had to build it, right? Much different from how we live, right? If I want a shirt, I just go to Walmart and buy a shirt. If I want a new house, I just go buy one, right? Not so much in the past. Okay, if you wanted something, you had to make it. Well, what starts to change is we start to have the arrival of factories, the arrival of machine production, and all of this has a sort of domino effect. It affects labor, it affects pay, it affects standard of living, and eventually it'll go on to affect politics and culture. So let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. Why is it so important? I think there's several key aspects we can focus on here. Several key things that happen during this time period. And the time period that we're talking about is roughly from the 17th century really up until today. There's some debate about if we're still living in the Industrial Revolution. Some scholars divide the Industrial Revolution between the first Industrial Revolution from about the 17th to 18th, maybe 19th century, to the second Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, and some people say we're living in the third or maybe the fourth Industrial Revolution. We won't really get into that. But the Industrial Revolution, for the purposes of an introduction class, right, the Industrial Revolution, roughly from the 17th century till today. That's what we'll say the time frame is. Okay, so what are the characteristics of the Industrial Revolution? First of all is we have urbanization. Urbanization simply refers to people moving to cities. So the economy in Britain, we'll stick with Britain for now, but the Industrial Revolution quickly spreads across the English Channel to Europe and eventually in the 19th century to America. Urbanization is the movement of people to cities. So remember, the economy in Britain pre-Industrial Revolution was primarily agricultural. Agriculture is what sustained the economy, and agriculture is what sustained everybody's economy for most of history. This has its roots in the Neolithic Revolution, probably the other most important event in history, but that's ancient history. Agriculture was the way of life and is sort of the sustaining economic product for most of human history. So before the Industrial Revolution, the basis of a country's economy was agriculture. So most people lived on farms. You have these big farms, you have family farms, and there were cities, but the cities weren't nearly as big as we think of cities today, where you have cities with population over 1 million people, right? That's unheard of in the ancient world. But what happens with the development of the factory system, which we'll talk about here in a second, is that people start to move from these farms to the cities in order to obtain work. And so this causes a big shift, not only in population and demographics, but it brings about some cultural changes as well. And we'll get to those here in a second. Okay, all of these are kind of tied together. You shouldn't really think of them as separate occurrences. They all kind of result, they all happen together, basically, okay? So, number 2 is pay, labor, life. And I need to talk about the factory system when I explain this. So, what happens with the Industrial Revolution is that the economy goes from being centered around agriculture to being centered around the production of goods. And goods are produced at this time in factories. Factories would hire local populations. They would say, come work for us. And they would give these people pay. This is much different from agriculture, right? So you would come in, you'd work for a day, and they'd say, all right, good, here's your $1, right? So your pay was $1 a day. So I'm not saying that's how much they actually got paid, it's just hypothetical, right? So you get paid $1. This produces a shift in labor. So we move from people farming, in which you would grow your crops, and if you had a good season, you would sell the extra and keep the other for yourself for basic food and basic provisions. Well, now you're not producing food. Now you're getting paid on a daily or perhaps even an hourly basis. And so labor changes. We move from farm labor to wage labor. I will pay you this much, a set price, for this amount of time. I'll pay you 2 cents an hour, I'll pay you $1 a day, whatever, right? You yourselves are familiar with this, right? We have a minimum wage, a minimum hourly wage, that businesses have to pay their employees. This is why we have this system, is because of the Industrial Revolution. You hire somebody and they agree to an hourly pay. I will give you this much money for this amount of time. Basically, I'll pay you for giving me a portion of your time. You heard the expression, time is money. This is literally true, right? Somebody's paying you for an hour of your life, basically. So, hourly pay, wage labor, and this affects the day-to-day life as well. So when I said that the Industrial Revolution has this sort of domino effect, this is what I mean. So before, people weren't really walking around with spending money. Maybe you had a good crop season and maybe you were able to sell a lot of your crops and make some extra money, but that money typically went back into the farm. You had to mend some fences, maybe you wanted to buy some new cattle, whatever. But now we have a different economic system. Now we have the beginning of what's referred to as the consumer society. So people are no longer growing their own food, which means that when they get paid, what are they going to do? Well, first of all, they got to go buy some food. People aren't living in their own houses anymore, so when they get paid, what do they got to do? They got to find an apartment to rent, or they got to pay their monthly rent, or maybe they want to buy their own house in the city. But now, for the first time, people's standard of living goes up as well. Standard of living is your basic income and how that affects your life. So people on a farm had a very low standard of living. Basically, you had enough money to get by if you were a poor farmer. If you were if you're on a family farm. Now, the people who own like multiple farms and have these like big sort of industrial farms, that's a different story, but we're talking about the common everyday person here. So the common everyday person's standard of living goes up. Now they have more money than they can spend on their basic needs. So now they have leftover money. So you go to the grocery store, you pay your rent, and now all of a sudden you have a few bucks in your pocket. What are you going to do? Well, this affects people's lives in that you have the beginning of, I said the beginning of consumer society. Well, along with this, you have the beginning of the entertainment industry. People want to go have fun. They want to relax after a day's work. So, well, you've always had like bars and brothels and stuff like that, but people are now going to them more often, right? Because they have more money to spend. But also, you have the increase in play production. People want to go see entertainment. They want to go see plays. Eventually, they want to go see movies. They want to buy fancier clothes. They want to make themselves look nice. All this other good stuff. So the pay and the labor affects other aspects as well. And so we've already mentioned this before. The third thing that we're going to talk about is machine production. And what I mean by machine production is this shift from handmade products, from making your own clothes, from growing your own food, to machine production. Now, machines are doing the jobs that people once did. You still need the people to make sure that the machines are operating correctly, but now we have the introduction of the machine and the concept of machine into the everyday life of the person. But this also has another result of the introductions of machines, and that's machines can do so much more than people. So before, if you wanted clothes, I said that you had to make it yourself, right? So imagine you're a poor, like 15th century English farmer, and you're out there working the fields and working and growing turnips or whatever, whatever they grew in England at the time, right? And your shirt gets ripped. And you say, oh man, I need a new shirt. Well, you go to grandma and you say, hey grandma, can you make me a new shirt? And grandma's like, sure, laddie. And she starts like stitching the cloth to make you a new shirt. And grandma's like sitting there working, but it takes grandma a long time. It takes her like a few weeks to make you another decent shirt. Not so with machine production. What it took grandma a few weeks to do, a machine can do now in a few minutes, or nowadays in a few seconds, right? So an increase in production, an increase in the amount of available goods as a result of these machines. And we talked about the factory system, and the factory system is sort of the hub for this new economic model. So the transition from the farm to the factory, if you want to think about it in that way. We also have the introduction of new energy sources. Primarily speaking, in the past, the primary energy source was wood to fuel the fire. But these machines require, some of these machines that we'll talk about over here, require more than wood. So we see the production of coal. Eventually, we're going to see the use of electricity as an energy source. And so now we move on to the new sorts of technology that are introduced during the Industrial Revolution. And these are some very, technology is compounded. The amount of new technology that's coming out becomes increasingly more common. Technological advancement becomes a daily aspect of life. And this is something that had never happened in the past. And we all experience this as well, but I'll get back there to that point here in a second. So the new technology that sort of rapidly come out, one right after the other. First of all, and these two can really be combined here, you have the invention of the steam engine and of rail technology. Rail technology was really popular and was first invented in the coal mines. You'd have the rail, which you put the coal in the baskets and you push it up in the rail, which makes it easier to move the coal from the mine to out of the mine. Well, eventually you have the introduction of the steam engine. And what people quickly realize is that they can combine these two technologies, and you have the invention of the train. And the train's important because now you can move these new goods that are being produced in bulk across longer distances and more quickly. Now, instead of putting maybe a few hundred pounds of something on the back of a carriage, you can put a few tons on the back of a train, and it can be transported at a quicker rate. And this just blew people's minds, how fast the train was, right? You also have the introduction of electricity. Eventually this is put into commercial use. If you've ever heard the debate about, or the tension between Tesla and Edison, right, over the manufacturing and production of the light bulb, electric light. This was a big thing for the time. Electricity, and eventually the use in communication technology, the use of the telegraph, the ability to relay information over vast distances almost instantaneously. And one of the first things that people did is they ran a telegraph line from London to New York across the Atlantic. And this was crazy for people at the time. So imagine this. So before the 17th century, if you were living in London and you wanted to communicate with somebody living in New York, the basic means of communication was the letter. So you'd write the letter, give it to the postman, he'd ride off to the ports, put it on a ship. The ship would take a week or so to cross the Atlantic to get to New York. And from you writing the letter till the time the person received it would take a month or two, give or take. Well, with the invention of the telegraph and the running of the telegraph line, now you could go into a telegraph office and communicate with that person in a matter of seconds. And this just blew people's mind. They just couldn't imagine how this was possible. So the Industrial Revolution affects every aspect of our daily lives. And perhaps the most important of which is this constant increase in technology brought about by the Industrial Revolution. And we still live in this age. We still live in the age where each generation experiences sort of this new leap in technological advancement. And all of this is a result of the Industrial Revolution. All right, folks, hope this helped. Email me if you got any questions.